Tonight, in a Fox 10 exclusive, one of only 4 women to sit on Arizona's death row, Debra Milke is telling her story. His mother, 25-year-old Debra Milke, was sentenced to death for arranging the murder.
Friends, today's story is one of murder, heartbreak, and a shocking twist at the end. We've got a mother and her 2 friends accused of murdering her son, but there is a massive twist at the end, so stay tuned, trust me. But with the mother, we start with her background. Debra Milke was a woman of mysterious origins. She emerged onto the scene with an enigmatic allure. She was born in the enchanting city of Berlin, in Germany, to a military family. She embarked on a transatlantic odyssey in 1965, weaving her intricate web across the vast tapestry of the United States. High school and college served as her training ground, honing her intellect and cunning while concealing the secrets that lay dormant within her. In 1984, Debra found herself entwined in love with a seemingly ordinary marriage to Mark Milke. Yet behind closed doors, whispers of discontent and unspoken tensions permeated the air, hinting at a darkness that lingered beneath the surface. Their union brought forth a child, Christopher Conan Milke, whose presence added a layer of complexity to the unfolding tale. But alas, the cracks in their delicate facade deepened, and the marriage succumbed to its inevitable demise, ending in a shroud of melancholy with their divorce in 1988. What transpired behind closed doors, the secrets that whispered in the shadows, only the discerning eye of a master detective could hope to uncover. Debra's sole motivation was to remove her drug-dependent husband, Mark, from their lives and secure sole custody of their son, Christopher. She used Christopher's welfare as a guise to justify her actions, but her true intention was to cut Mark out of her son's life completely. Despite her claims of love, Debra harbored resentment towards Mark and used their shared child as a means of control. She set strict conditions for Mark to be a part of Christopher's life, demanding that he give up his drug and alcohol habits completely. Her unwavering stance on supervised visitations and sole custody showed her determination to limit Mark's involvement, prioritizing her own desires over Christopher's need for a father figure. While Debra attended substance abuse counseling sessions with Mark, it was not out of genuine support but rather to gather evidence against him. She manipulated the situation, using Mark's struggles as ammunition to secure sole custody, citing the need to protect Christopher's safety. Debra's career choices were purely self-serving. She hopped from one insurance company to another, solely driven by personal ambition and the pursuit of better opportunities. The employee benefits package, especially medical coverage for herself and Christopher, held more importance to her than any other aspect of her employment. Unconcerned about the future, Debra neglected to purchase a dedicated life insurance policy. The nominal life insurance rider provided through her employee benefits package seemed sufficient at the time. She never shared details of her job or benefits with anyone, maintaining secrecy to manipulate situations to her advantage. When Mark faced legal trouble and spent months in jail, Debra saw it as an opportunity to solidify her position. She sought solace with her mother-in-law, Ilse Milke, not out of genuine affection, but to create an illusion of a supportive family environment for Christopher, despite the fractured relationship with his father. Upon Mark's release, Debra cunningly presented him with the ultimatum of rehab or a lengthy prison sentence, using her influence to dictate his choices. She manipulated the situation further by involving the parole officer and suggesting rehabilitation. But this was not out of compassion, but to maintain control over Mark and subsequently Christopher. Debra's calculated actions continued as she allowed Mark to have supervised visits with Christopher once he completed rehab. However, her true intentions were revealed when she ceased hearing from him. She deliberately cut off communication, leaving Mark in the dark about his son's life. When Mark requested another visit, Debra agreed under the condition that his sponsor was present. However, her true colors were exposed when she arrived to find Mark high and surrounded by people. Fueled by rage, she provoked a confrontation, setting the stage for a physical altercation. During the altercation, Debra feigned victimhood, seizing the opportunity to portray Mark as the aggressor. She utilized the incident to strengthen her case, manipulating the system and highlighting her perceived role as the protective mother. In the aftermath, Debra continued to manipulate the legal process, presenting herself as the innocent party and Mark as a danger to Christopher's well-being. She used every tool at her disposal to ensure sole custody, employing skilled lawyers to secure her victory. In the end, Debra's actions left a lasting impact on Christopher's life, tainting his perception of trust, love, and family. Now, here's a question I have for you. Is disliking someone, is hating someone reason enough for them to be found guilty in a courtroom? It's an interesting conundrum, right? How many times do we see famous people who have been vilified, but in some kind of legal process, they've been found not guilty? Well, even though it seems that Debra did not handle herself in the best light during the divorce, that does not make her a murderer. So let me now get into the incident. In 1989, Debra worked at an insurance agency and lived with her son Christopher and her roommate James Stiers, who was an unemployed and disabled veteran who watched Christopher. In September 1989, shortly after beginning a new job, Debra took out a $5,000 life insurance policy on Christopher as part of her employee benefit plan. The policy named Debra as the beneficiary. Sometime between the time she bought the policy and the incident I'm about to tell you about, Debra and James discussed the policy and the benefits. Now, on the last evening of his short life, Christopher saw Santa Claus at the mall. He woke up the next morning begging his mother to let him go again. Debra agreed and sent Christopher to the mall with her roommate James Stiers. James lived with his 2-year-old daughter and shared an apartment with Debra and Christopher. On Saturday, December 2nd, 1989, James and Christopher left their apartment at 11 a.m. James told Debra that he was going to the Metro Center. Christopher wanted to go along and see Santa Claus again. Debra said they could take her car. James and Christopher picked up James' longtime friend, Roger Scott. James took Scott to 2 drugstores, and then the 2 men and the boy had pizza for lunch at about 1 p.m. After lunch, they drove out to the desert. Christopher was told they were going to look for snakes in the wash. Instead, Christopher was shot 3 times in the back of his head, and his body was left lying in the wash. Scott and James then drove to the Metro Center. They arrived around 2:30 p.m., separated, and James enlisted the help of a Sears employee to look for Christopher after James told the employee that Christopher had disappeared from the restroom while James was in a stall. While James and the employee were looking for Christopher, they ran into Scott, and James acted surprised to see him at the Metro Center. James asked Scott if he had seen Christopher, and Scott said he had not. James called mall security at 2:30 p.m. After mall security was unsuccessful in locating Christopher, the police were called at 4 p.m. James also told the police that he brought the boy to the Metro Center to see Santa Claus, and then he had disappeared from the Sears restroom while James was in a stall. James told the police that he and Christopher ate lunch at Peter Piper Pizza and then went to the Metro Center. Later that evening, when James and a police officer were retracing James's activities that day, James first mentioned that he had been with Scott that day. James said that he, Christopher, and Scott ran errands and ate lunch. James said he then took Scott home, and James and Christopher went to the Metro Center at around 2 p.m. They entered Sears, and that was where Christopher disappeared. James called Debra several times while the police were searching the Metro Center. James stayed with the police at the mall until 3 p.m. the next day. Ultimately, the police took him to the police station to get a taped statement and then took him to the home. The police then arrested James at his apartment on Sunday evening, December the 3rd. You see, it was his friend Scott who led police to Christopher's body in the wash in northwest Phoenix. Christopher had been shot 3 times in the back of his head. Later, police located near the murder scene some .22 caliber shell casings and one live .22 round that was similar to the bullets found in James's possession. A pair of black tennis shoes belonging to James was found in the parking lot near Sears at the Metro Center Mall. These shoes had a tread pattern similar to shoe prints found next to Christopher's body in the wash. But now a question remains. Where is Debra involved in all of this? What was the motive of these 2 individuals to take Christopher's life? Well, one of the key pieces of evidence in this case came from police officer Armando Saldate. He was known to be aggressive and have a unique style. He flew to Arizona, where Debra went after learning of her son's death, and he questioned her. According to Saldate, Scott said that Debra had been involved. Detective Saldate seized on the statement and flew to helicopter to Florence, Arizona, where Debra had gone to stay with her father and stepfamily after she learned of Christopher's disappearance. In Florence, a deputy sheriff invited Debra to headquarters to wait for Saldate. Now, Saldate found Debra waiting in a 15 by 15 foot room of the Pinal County Jail. She hadn't been arrested, nor had she been told anything about Christopher. Saldate pushed into the room and introduced himself. He pulled his chair close to Debra, a 4 arms length at most, and leaned in even closer. That's when he told her that the police had found her son dead. Debra replied saying, "Wait, what?" And Saldate also reported that Debra started yelling and seemed to cry. But the detective saw through her ploy. He went on to say that when someone is told that their child was murdered and they start to sob and no tears come to their eyes, it's obviously a way for her to try to make me feel for her. And I didn't buy it. I didn't buy it at all. This is what he said at the time. Saldate placed Debra under arrest and read out her Miranda rights. According to Saldate, when Debra started to tell him that she'd complained about Christopher to James, but never realized James would hurt the boy, Saldate shut her down. He says, "I immediately, of course, told her that wasn't the truth, and I told her I wasn't going to tolerate her, that I wasn't there to listen to lies, nor did I have the time." With that, Saldate claimed Debra opened up to him about the most intimate details of her life. He said that in the span of just 30 minutes, Debra knowingly waived her rights to silence and counsel, reminisced about her high school years when she was in love with life. She feigned tears, calmed down, narrated her failed marriage to Mark, his drug and alcohol abuse, and his arrests. She recounted how she'd gotten pregnant while on birth control and contemplated an abortion, even making an appointment for one, discussed her fear that Christopher was becoming just like his father. Saldate claimed she then confessed to a murder conspiracy, characterized the conspiracy as a bad judgment call, and solicited Saldate's opinion about whether her family would ever understand. By the end of the interview, Saldate had more than just clinched the case against Debra, he'd helped her emotionally. He claims he helped her get it off her chest. According to Saldate, Debra said she was starting to feel better and was starting to get some of her self-esteem back. Saldate also said that Debra asked whether she would be released that night, and when he said she wouldn't be, she asked whether the court would give her probation for life if she could have her tubes tied and never have children again. But there's an issue. Debra always denied being involved in the murder, and her account of the interrogation differs substantially from Saldate's. As I said earlier, is not liking someone enough to convict them. Let's keep going. Debra testified that she told Saldate she didn't understand the Miranda warnings, and that when Saldate asked if she wanted the interrogation tape, she said, "No, I need a lawyer." According to Debra, Saldate ignored her request, instead putting his hands on her knees and proceeding with the interrogation. He then embellished and twisted Debra's statements to make it sound like she had confessed. The jury had no independent way of verifying these divergent accounts. Saldate did not record the interrogation, even though his supervisor instructed him to do so. Saldate didn't bring a tape recorder to the interview, nor did he ask anyone to witness the interrogation by sitting in the room or watching through a two-way mirror. Saldate also skipped the basic step of having Debra sign a Miranda waiver. Not even Saldate's interview notes made it into the court. See, he testified that he destroyed them after writing his official report 3 days after the interrogation. The jury thus had nothing more than Saldate's word that Debra confessed. Everything the state claimed happened in the interrogation room depended on believing Saldate's testimony. Without his testimony, the prosecution had no case against Debra, as there was no physical evidence linking her to the crime, and neither of her supposed co-conspirators, James and Scott, would testify against her. But Saldate was an experienced officer, and his account of Debra's purported confession proved convincing. So, with all this, the three went to trial. Scott and James were both sentenced to death. But what about the fate of Christopher's mother? Well, the jury found Debra guilty of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, child abuse, and kidnapping. She was sentenced to death. Now, regardless of what you think of her, if the evidence was purely based on Saldate's word, is that enough? You see, in December 2007, the American Civil Liberties Union of Arizona filed an amicus brief in support of Debra, who by then had been on death row for 18 years. Imagine being in jail for 18 years based on word of mouth. The brief raised questions regarding the admissibility of uncorroborated and unrecorded confessions by Debra. In 2009, Debra had been sitting on Arizona's death row for 20 years, largely because a police detective said she confessed to plotting her 4-year-old son's murder. Debra could have gotten a new trial and even her freedom because the detective skipped one of the most basic steps when officers interview suspects, getting them to sign a Miranda waiver and giving up their right to remain silent. See, the judge, during the appeals, he said, I have never seen a case where there has been no signed Miranda waiver. Judge Alex Kaczynski of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco said this at a hearing in August 2008. He said, I don't know any place in the civilized world in the last 30 years. He added, where a state has found a waiver of constitutional rights without a signed waiver. Judge Kaczynski and 2 other judges on the appeals court found no evidence existed proving that Debra voluntarily, knowingly, and intelligently waived her rights in the police interview in 1989. The judges ordered Judge Robert Broomfield of the Federal District Court in Phoenix to conduct a hearing on that point and issue his finding. Now, on March 14, 2013, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit threw out Debra's conviction, ruling that Debra did not receive a fair trial. It held that Debra's rights had been violated by the failure to turn over Saldate's personnel file to the defense. This is fucking ridiculous. How does it take 20 years of this woman's life for you guys to figure out what we all knew at the time? Well, not at the time. I was like 2 years old. But you understand what I'm saying, right? Anyone of sound mind knows that's not enough evidence. 20 years you locked her up. The file included multiple instances of misconduct, including 8 cases where confessions, indictments, or convictions were thrown out because Saldate either lied under oath or violated the suspect's rights during the interrogation. The court ruled that because the prosecution didn't look into Saldate's history of misconduct, Arizona had violated its obligation to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense. In their opinion, the circuit court said Debra's alleged confession, as reported by the Pinal County Sheriff's Detective Saldate, was the only direct evidence linking her to the crime. But the confession was only as good as Saldate's word, and he's the only one who claims to have heard Debra confess, and there's no recording, there's no written statement, and there's no other evidence to suggest this was the case. It's hard to imagine anything more relevant to the jury or the judge's determination whether to believe Saldate than evidence that Saldate lied under oath and trampled the constitutional rights of suspects in discharging his official duties. If even a single juror had found Saldate untrustworthy based on the documentation that he habitually lied under oath or that he took advantage of the woman he had in his power, there would have been at least a hung jury. Likewise, if this evidence had been disclosed, it may well have led the judge to order a new trial, enter judgment notwithstanding the verdict, or at least impose a sentence less than death. The prosecution did its best to impugn Debra's credibility. It wasn't entitled at the same time to hide the evidence that undermined Saldate's credibility. And on July the 8th, 2013, Arizona's Attorney General's office announced its intention to retry Debra and seek the death penalty for the murder of her son. But eventually, on September the 6th, 2013, Debra was released with a $250,000 bond set by the judge Rosa Ross of the Maricopa County Superior Court. Debra left the jail without talking to reporters and lived in a house in Phoenix bought by her supporters. Now, I can't believe this. On December the 18th, 2013, the same judge, Judge Rose, he granted Saldate, the police officer, his request to invoke his Fifth Amendment right not to testify. I understand. I live in America. I know how big the Constitution is. I know how you guys love all these amendments, but for fuck's sake, for 20 years you've been lying through your teeth. None of these rules should apply to you. Get on your ass and go and testify. Moron. See, to me, what angers me about this case is the death of a boy, and we'll never really know why. There was some suspicions that maybe the mother did it for the $5,000 insurance payout. Maybe. Who knows? Either way, Saldate didn't care whether she's guilty or not. He just wanted a dub on his scorecard, and he was willing to put a woman away for life or even the death sentence just for his own career advancement, if you like. Fucking disgusting. On December the 11th, 2014, an Arizona State Appeals Court ordered the dismissal of the murder charges against Debra, ruling that a retrial would result in unconstitutional double jeopardy. On March the 17th, 2015, the Arizona Supreme Court declined to review the appeal court decision, and on March the 23rd, 2015, Judge Rosa dismissed the case. As I said, imagine that. 20 years plus behind bars. You got sentenced to death. So I can only imagine the mental toll that took on her mind. And this is why I asked you the question. When I told you about her marriage and how it all unfolded, you can make a decision who's wrong, who's right, blah, blah, blah. You can like her, you can hate her, you can love her, whatever. But that is not a reason to put this woman away based on bullshit evidence. You may even believe that she was in on it. You may believe, well, if these two men are going to take the son, shoot him, the only real explanation is monetary value. Because if there was some kind of sickness involved, if there was some kind of mental illness, generally speaking, these end up in sexual crimes. Generally speaking, you understand what I'm saying? But this was a straight case. They took him to the desert, shot him in the head, and left. And they only shot him 3 times. That doesn't justify it. What I'm trying to tell you is when you shoot someone 10 times, emotions are involved. It's a different context altogether. So they probably did it just for the money. And maybe she was in on it. Maybe she was not. Either way, that is not enough evidence to convict her. This bastard Armando Saldate is a fucking idiot. But love her or hate her, being released from prison was the only justified conclusion in this case. Comment, tell me what you think.